This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 580 of the Late Round Podcast, the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. FanDuel and Simple Mobile have partnered up to add an extra layer of excitement to one of the biggest free-to-play contests on the market. Introducing the FanDuel free-to-play Gridiron Pick'em contest presented by Simple Mobile, a completely free-to-play contest that gives you a chance to win big on Sundays. Here's how it works. Simply answer Pick'em questions for the week's slate of NFL games and compete for a chance to win your share of $10,000 in cash prizes. If you're one of the highest scoring users on the day, you'll be eligible to win some cold hard cash. Kickoff will be here before you know it, so head to fanduel.com/free/contest/gridironpick'em and make your picks today. And skip the contracts with high-speed data, talk, and text on a powerful nationwide network with Simple Mobile. For more details, visit fanduel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app. Eligibility restrictions apply. It's a 15 transactions day. Let's get to it. Add and sell Rhamondre Stevenson. So as all of you know, unless you just didn't pay attention to football on Sunday, Rhamondre Stevenson went ham against the Browns. He carried the ball 20 times, he had 5 targets, he turned that into 114 total yards and 2 touchdowns. It was the best fantasy performance from any New England Patriots running back all season long. And it just so happened to come in a game where Stevenson finally got his shot to be the team's bell cow back. And he really was a bell cow in Week 10. He saw 69% of the team's running back rushes, that's pretty nice, to go along with a 20% target share. That was the third highest running back rush share for a New England running back this season, and it was the second highest target share. But get this, guys, Stevenson became just the fourth New England running back since 2011 to hit both of those marks, to have a 69% running back rush share and a 20% target share. We know the Patriots have usually used their running backs in specific roles. They usually don't have a bell cow back. But they did in Rhamondre Stevenson on Sunday. We could see that as a reason to buy into Stevenson, but I'm seeing it as a reason to sell him. Now, I'm a fan of his game. If you guys listened to this show during the offseason, then you might recall me talk about his receiving profile coming out of college. He was a big-bodied back, but he had a really strong receiving profile. You don't usually see that. But this situation for Stevenson is not ideal. Damian Harris was out on Sunday. If he's able to return, we can't just assume that Rhamondre Stevenson just sees this type of workload. Not only has Harris been fine this season with an above-average success rate, but we have a decade's worth of sample size showing us that Rhamondre Stevenson's Week 10 usage isn't normal for a New England Patriots running back. It's not normal for a Bill Belichick coach team. The way Rhamondre Stevenson keeps this up, maintains this pace, is if Damian Harris just isn't involved. And I just don't see that happening. Now, clearly, don't trade Stevenson away just to do it. I think there's gray area to every transaction. We're playing probability here. Is there a chance that Stevenson breaks the Patriots' mold and becomes their first true bell cow in over a decade? Sure. There's a chance. Should we be buying into that? I don't think so. Because odds are Damian Harris is going to have some sort of role when he returns. We could see Rhamondre Stevenson be like the Rex Burkhead in this offense. Stevenson should be rostered. Add him off the waiver wire if he's out there. But if there's someone in your league who thinks that this is going to be the norm, then I would feel fine selling him. Hold Dalton Schultz. So Michael Gallup returned to the Dallas offense in Week 10. And things were a little bit different for the Cowboys offense, unsurprisingly. Amari Cooper, for instance, he had a 12.1% target share. That was a season low. CeeDee Lamb obviously had a big day, but his target share still dipped. He had a 21.2% target share when his season-long average is closer to 23%. Dalton Schultz looked like the biggest loser, though. He had a target share of just 6.1% on Sunday. He had averaged a target share per game of 21.9% since Week 2. So this seems pretty alarming, because you can pinpoint this one event, Michael Gallup returning, and you can say that's the reason that Dalton Schultz lost his work. But here's the good news. Schultz still ran the second most routes for Dallas on Sunday, according to Pro Football Focus. Look, the Dallas offense is filled with playmakers. This is going to happen. We'll see a rotation of these big performances. Or when a player doesn't have a huge performance like CeeDee Lamb had on Sunday, we're going to see all of these players have above average performances. I don't think that's a reason to sell, though. It's tough to sell full-time players in high-powered offenses. It's even harder to sell these full-time players in high-powered offenses when they play a position that lacks any sort of depth in fantasy football, which is exactly what you get with Dalton Schultz playing the tight end position. Schultz is going to take a volume hit with Michael Gallup back. I talked about that on a mailbag episode a couple of weeks ago. And you could argue that everyone in that offense will, because Michael Gallup is a good wide receiver. When you add good players to an offense, those players are going to demand some sort of volume. You just have to remember that the offense is going to generate a lot of points. And that can at least help the target decline a little bit. Add D'Onta Foreman. So since Derrick Henry's probable season-ending injury, the Titans' backfield has been a mess. I don't think that's very shocking, though. In Week 9, we saw Adrian Peterson have a 45.5% running back rush share. That was the most on the team. He had 10 rushes. Jeremy McNichols in that game, he was second with 7 rushes. And then D'Onta Foreman had 5. And then all the while, McNichols, who's been used as a pass catcher throughout this season, he was the only one with a relevant target share back in Week 9. Now fast forward to this past weekend. Things were a little bit different. D'Onta Foreman was the one who led in running back rush share at 47.8%. He turned that into 11 carries for 30 yards on the ground. That doesn't sound that great, but they were facing the Saints. And he also had 2 targets and caught both of them for a backfield high 48 receiving yards. Now McNichols once again led that backfield in target share. And chances are Foreman's not going to be a reliable fantasy football piece moving forward. He was on the field for just 35% of Tennessee's snaps on Sunday. But he's currently available almost everywhere. He's free to acquire. And who knows, maybe his decent performance against the Saints, that's going to elevate him a little bit. That's going to force the Titans to throw him on the field a little bit more. Because he did look good. Buy the Seattle Seahawks passing attack. Look, it was a really, really rough Sunday for this Seattle passing attack. Russell Wilson didn't look like he was in sync with his pass catchers whatsoever. He actually posted his lowest fantasy total since 2016. But we know Russell Wilson is good. We know that DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett are both good. And both of those wide receivers had 21% target shares against Green Bay. That's fine. But beyond all of that, the Seahawks have a really appealing schedule over their next 4 games. They face 3 top 8 teams and adjusted points allowed to the quarterback position. Even if those opponents are better against wide receivers, we know where Russell Wilson's targets are going. We know where he funnels his targets. They do get a tougher matchup in Week 11 against Arizona before that cakewalk stretch, but I wouldn't want to wait. If you can buy at a lower cost this week, if you can get Russell Wilson or Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf this week, I would do it. Add Dan Arnold. I've talked about Dan Arnold so many freaking times on this podcast. This is the last time I'm going to bring him up on the 15 Transaction Show. But here's the deal. Arnold has now scored double-digit PPR points in 4 of his last 5 games. He's averaged a target share per game of 20.4% since DJ Chark's season-ending injury. That's not easy to find at the tight end position. And over the last 5 weeks since that time, he's leading the Jaguars in targets. He has more targets than Marvin Jones, Laviska Shenault, and Jamal Agnew. Please add Dan Arnold. Buy Brandon Cooks. If you're a team that needs to stack wins right now, I think Brandon Cooks is a great buy. The Texans finally have Tyrod Taylor back, which I understand he wasn't good back in Week 9. Miami picked him off 3 times. But he was coming off that injury, and the Dolphins have actually looked good defensively over the last couple of weeks. You would hope that Tyrod Taylor is an upgrade over Davis Mills. And that means that as long as Brandon Cooks is maintaining a high target share, his fantasy production has a chance to spike. In 3 games with Taylor at quarterback this season, Cooks has averaged a target share per game of 35.1%. That number is about 28% with Davis Mills. Now, I know that this is a small sample size, but it at least shows that Brandon Cooks has elite target share upside. And if you look at Houston's schedule, it's pretty good. 4 of their next 5 games are against teams that rank in the top half of the league in adjusted points allowed per game to wide receivers. And 3 of those games are against teams that rank in the top 10. The nice schedule combined with a really good target share could mean a lot of fantasy points for Brandon Cooks. Add Wayne Gallman. It's a really, really tough week on the waiver wire, but Wayne Gallman's not a terrible short-term add. Gallman actually led the Falcons by a large margin in rush attempts on Sunday. Some of that was definitely due to the game just being a blowout, But Gallman was seeing work in the first quarter with Mike Davis not getting his typical workload. Gallman could have also seen more work because Cordero Patterson suffered an ankle injury in that game. And as of today, as of this recording, his status for Week 11 is in question. And things are really iffy with that because the Falcons play on Thursday night, unfortunately. So if Patterson sits, Gallman could see a decent workload. And with how things were divided up in Week 10, he might even lead the backfield in touches for a second straight week. Hold James Conner. Arizona had a rough game against Carolina on Sunday, but James Conner was still able to put together a 15-point performance in PPR formats. He was an RB2, and he found the end zone once again. He has 11 rushing touchdowns over his last 8 games. Now, some of you might be thinking to sell high, because there's no way he's going to maintain this sort of touchdown pace. And I can understand the touchdown regression logic to some degree, but keep in mind that his peripherals were pretty much on par with what he had seen in Week 9, when he went absolutely nuts against the 49ers. In Week 9, Conner saw 67.7% of the team's running back rushes. It was 62.5% this past week. In Week 9, he had a pretty unsustainable 19.2% target share. In Week 10, his target share really wasn't that bad. It was 13.8%. With Kyler Murray coming back soon, Conner should still be treated as an RB1 as long as Chase Edmonds is sidelined. That performance in Week 10 is not going to be the norm, even if his touchdown rate falls. Add Bryan Edwards. So like I've been saying, the waiver wire is not very strong this week. You're going to have to take some chances. I think Bryan Edwards is a decent enough dart throw. He had a 3-catch, 88-yard, 1-touchdown performance against the Chiefs, and that came after a bad Week 9 game against the Giants where he failed to catch any of his 4 targets. He had only an 8.7% target share in that game. In Week 10, one with a better one-on-one matchup, that share jumped closer to 12%. And as my colleague Brandon Gadula noted in this week's waiver wire column over on Numberfire, when you give proper weight to the 4 targets that Edwards had on Sunday night, they really came out to be closer to 6.5 targets in terms of value. Because he had a 23.1 average depth of target, and he kept seeing targets of 16 or more air yards. 3 of his 4 went that distance. As we know, the Raiders don't have Henry Ruggs anymore. They need a reliable down-the-field threat. And Edwards, so far without Henry Ruggs, he has almost 31% of the team's air yards. That leads the team. Now, am I confident that Edwards is going to be an every-week starter? Absolutely not. But is he worth an add off the waiver wire this week? I think in leagues with 12 or more teams, probably. Sell Antonio Gibson. Week 10 was the first time that Antonio Gibson gave us an RB1 performance in PPR formats this year. And obviously it came against the Buccaneers, a team that not only stops the run well, but it's one that's just a tough matchup in general. Entering that game, we all figured that Washington would be in a negative game script. That would hurt Antonio Gibson. But then the opposite happened. Because fantasy football. But Gibson saw a career-high 24 rush attempts in that game. But here's the thing. His backfield share numbers really weren't all that different than what we've seen all season long. He did have an 80% running back rush share, and he's only hit that number twice this season. But he had plenty of other games in like the upper 70% range. And his target share was just 6.3%. He continues to see games with a sub 10% target share. He hasn't seen a 10% target share or better since week 1. And even in a good game script, Gibson still ran fewer routes than teammate J.D. McKissic. What happens when Washington, a 3-win team, trails in games? What happens when they see a negative game script? We have a pretty large sample of what happens. They utilize J.D. McKissic. They're gonna run the ball less. Washington had a 48.5% pass rate on Sunday when their season-long average per game entering the week was closer to 57%. We can't and we shouldn't just assume that Washington's going to be leading consistently from here on out, like they were against Tampa Bay. And that's even truer when you look at their schedule. They still have multiple games against the Cowboys this season, and then they face the Seahawks and they face the Raiders over the next few weeks too. Those are not easy games to win. And if they're in a negative game script, that's going to hurt Antonio Gibson because they utilize J.D. McKissic as a pass catcher in those types of scripts. They utilize him as a pass catcher, period. I think he's still an RB2 given the state of the position, but if there's someone willing to pay top dollar after this performance, I would sell Gibson. Add Adam Troutman. Over Adam Trautman's last 3 games, he's seen target shares of 17.1%, 16.7%, and 18.2%. He had basically been seeing shares under the 10% mark before that point in time. There's been a big uptick in work. And the reason for that is that the Saints are utilizing him more as a receiver. He's run around on a little over 69% of the team's dropbacks over the last 3 weeks. That number was about 62% from weeks 1 through 7. And honestly, guys, sometimes this happens. Sometimes players just simply develop. It's not like Adam Trautman's been in the league for 6 years. So his target share is something that shouldn't be ignored at a position that lacks consistency. So feel free to add him now because this could become a trend worth utilizing in your lineup. Buy Corey Davis. Now, as up and down as the Jets' offense has been this year, Corey Davis hasn't been that bad. He scored 14.7 or more PPR points in all but 3 games, and he's seen 5 or more targets in every contest this season. His target share per game is about 20%. There's nothing wrong with that. If you want to take a chance and give up some bench assets to get Corey Davis, I don't mind it. The Jets, on paper, have one tough matchup for wide receivers from now through the end of the season, according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed method. And you can probably get Corey Davis for next to nothing. So sure, throw some bench assets and try to get Corey Davis. See if Zach Wilson starts playing better. See if this offense starts clicking a little bit more. Because if it does, at least the schedule is there. Add Cam Newton. So I wrote this in my column, but I said it took Cam Newton 1 play to remind us that he's a beast at the goal line. It took him 2 plays to let us know that he may have honest fantasy value from now through the end of the season. Look, guys, I don't know how this Cam Newton story is going to end. What I do know is that he's a mobile quarterback, and we should value that in fantasy football. He can score points on the ground. As bad as he was in 2020, he still had 8 top 12 performances at the quarterback position. He still averaged over 17 points per game. And that was with 4 single-digit point performances. He has weekly upside. He scored 12 rushing touchdowns last year. And with a better supporting cast in Carolina, maybe he's able to resurrect that arm talent a little bit. Regardless, though, he's a strong streamer this week against Washington. I know Washington's coming off a game where they played well against Tom Brady, but they still rank as one of the most advantageous matchups for quarterbacks when looking at adjusted points allowed. And they're going to also be without Chase Young. Add Tua Tagovailoa. So it sounds like Tua's going to get the start this weekend, and he gets a plus matchup against the Jets. New York has been the 9th best matchup for opposing quarterbacks this year in adjusted points allowed. And guys, Tua has been really underrated as a fantasy quarterback over the last month. He didn't even start the game this past week, and he finishes a fringe QB1. And he's only had 2+ matchups this year. In those games against Jacksonville and Atlanta, he averaged about 24 fantasy points per game. I think he's a really safe bet to score some points off the waiver wire this week. Add the Miami Dolphins defense. So speaking of Miami's matchup against New York, you should stream that defense. They've played lights out over their last 2 games. They intercepted Tyrod Taylor 3 times. They intercepted Lamar Jackson last week once. And over this time, they have 9 sacks. Now they get a team that's been one of the best for opposing defenses when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. They're only rostered in 25% of Yahoo leagues. You should add them. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to add Marcus Johnson. Marcus Johnson was the target share leader for the Titans on Sunday. He had 6 targets and he caught 5 of them for 100 yards. According to Pro Football Focus, he ran the 2nd most routes for the Titans. And that's what we saw in week 8 without Julio Jones, where Johnson saw a 15.6% target share against the Colts. The more I think about it, the more I think Johnson is a more attractive add this week than Bryan Edwards. He's seen an obvious spike without Julio, and he's in an offense that could really utilize a number 2 option. So I think adding Johnson this week makes a lot of sense. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I got the 10 Trends show for you tomorrow. I'll talk to you then.